Welcome to Wilmington, North Carolina, one of the most historically significant African-American cities in the United States. Africans and their descendants have been central to Wilmington's development since its incorporation in 1739. Strategically located where the two branches of the Cape Fear River meet, the colonial settlement quickly became a chief port for the region. Southeastern North Carolina had an abundance of pitch pine forests, and Wilmington was the leading producer and exporter of naval stores for the English Empire. The coastal region also boosted a small, tightly knit gentry class whose wealth derived from vast rice plantations. The success of area merchants and planters, however, rested heavy on enslaved labor. Brought into the port city by the hundreds, enslaved blacks soon outnumbered whites in New Hanover County. North Carolina's colonial assembly passed legal codes prohibiting enslaved people from reading, writing, testifying in court, congregating in groups, bearing arms, and moving about the countryside. The institution of slavery expanded and changed as time progressed. Before the Civil War, most enslaved individuals were bought and sold at the market house, which stood at the intersection of Front and Market Street. Enslaved individuals had no legal right to control their own labor, but owners frequently permitted them to gather at the market during slack times and hire themselves out. Unskilled slaves might work for the Wilmington docks, unloading cargo for a few months during the winter, but a skilled artisan could be quote-unquote let for as much as a full year. Although enslaved individuals were required to return the proceeds of this labor to their masters, some masters actually granted them a share, and many slaves managed to buy their freedom for themselves and for their family members. As a result, Wilmington became home to a large number of free blacks. Like many cities throughout the antebellum South, Wilmington had no exclusive white or black neighborhoods. Urban slaves generally lived in close proximity to their masters, and sometimes they shared the same building, and sometimes they occupied a specially built quote-unquote quarter nearby. As the city's economy expanded, people of all races, creeds, and cultures came here looking for work. By the 1850s, persons of African descent had secured a particular niche in the building trades, which they occupied for many decades. This happened because of people like James Drawburn Sampson, who was a son of a slave owner. His father taught him carpentry, freed him, and then purchased him 10 enslaved individuals and said, "Now do for them as I have done for you." During the Civil War, Wilmington became a chief port of the Confederacy. Protected by Fort Fisher, Block A runners slipped into the Cape Fear River, bringing much-needed supplies, arms, and ammunition. They also supported a level of prosperity that was unusual in wartime. The surrender of Fort Fisher on January 15th of 1865 signaled the end of an era. A few weeks later, Union forces occupied the city. 2 brigades of U.S. colored troops, 3,149 men to be exact, participated in this campaign and suffered heavy casualties. African-American soldiers were later interred in the northwest corner of the Federal Cemetery on Market Street. The Civil War and its aftermath had 2 significant repercussions for the city's residents. It devastated their economy and forever altered relations between the two races. But having gained not only their freedom, but the vote and access to education, African-Americans in Reconstruction-era Wilmington pursued a wide array of advancements in the political, economic, and social spheres. These advances were linked to the city's renewed prosperity. In the first 2 decades after the Civil War, Wilmington expanded its role as a regional railroad center and began to attract new businesses. Buoyed by their economic success, members of the city's African-American community also acquired a foothold in the city's county and state politics. In 1897, Wilmington had 125 African-American entrepreneurs owning and operating businesses and had become a national symbol of black success. African-Americans who were in the majority owned 10 of the city's 11 dining establishments and 20 of its 22 barbershops. Black people worked for themselves as architects, lawyers, doctors, jewelers, watchmakers, and tailors. Black men occupied 3 of the 10 alderman seats after the Fusionist Party claimed power, and the literacy rate among black males in the city was actually higher than the whites during that time. Because most of the city's freedmen favored the Republican Party, leading Democrats grew alarmed. They, like many other Southerners, perceived the growing political power of African Americans as not only an obstacle to economic development, but a challenge to their traditional way of life. Beginning in the 1890s, white Wilmingtonians, like white Americans elsewhere, took aggressive measures to halt this dual threat. The result was Wilmington's and the nation's infamous government overthrow of 1898. On the morning of November 10th, a group of white men, mostly armed, burned the offices of the Daily Record, a black newspaper across town, because it condemned practices like lynching alleged black rapists and argued that some white women willingly pursued relationships with black men. It was the only daily black newspaper printed in North Carolina at that time. While the white mob was returning to their homes in Brooklyn at the intersection of North 4th and Harnett Street, they came upon a group of black men, mostly unarmed, who gathered on the southwest corner to discuss the new and violent turns of events. The whites ordered the blacks to disperse. The blacks refused, and after a heated exchange of words, the first shots of the day were fired. Over the next few hours, Wilmington experienced one of the worst politically and racially motivated episodes in American history. Homes and churches were damaged, businesses were destroyed, and lives were forever altered. When the smoke cleared, 3 white men had been wounded, and a number between 700 to 300 blacks were dead. Most of the city's violence had taken place in Brooklyn, and an unknown number of the neighborhood's black residents sought refuge in nearby swamps and cemeteries. Others hid in their homes, and some fled Wilmington altogether. At City Hall, the armed mob of whites, led by some of Wilmington's most prominent citizens, removed from office the city's duly elected biracial government in what historians consider the only successful coup d'etat in the history of the United States. This monument serves as a symbol of Wilmington's commitment to an inclusive society, a tribute to all who over the years have struggled to reverse the tragic consequences of the 1898 racial violence, and a memorial to those African Americans killed in that violence. Before November 10, 1898, Wilmington's African-American population was at 60%. After 1898, Wilmington's African-American population dropped to 39%, and today it is as low as 18%. This event marked the onset of the Jim Crow era in North Carolina. The 20th century brought many changes to Wilmington. By 1910, blacks had lost their numerical majority and were once again subject to segregation by statutes. Despite a brief reprieve during World War I, Wilmington's economy was declining rapidly. Many African Americans left during the 1920s and 30s to seek better paying jobs in northern cities and the industrial Piedmont. Those who stayed turned inward and focused their attention on personal, family, and community interests. As a result of World War II, Wilmington and the rest of the South experienced a boost of economic activity that lasted throughout the 1950s and 1960s. From 1936 until 1966, the Negro Traveler's Green Book provided valuable lodging resource information for middle-class tourists and the country's popular entertainers. James Jimmy Lawton owns one of those Jim Crow segregation-era special properties. The Payne's Tourist Home of 1956 ad describes the structure as steam-heated and a provider of comfort and convenience, quote-unquote, where particular people stop. Who are some of these particular people? The Duke Ellington Band, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong, Lionel Hampton, and many other musicians were some of their special guests. Over the course of the Green Book's 30 years in publication, Wilmington had 50 locations listed, and that was the second most in the state behind Charlotte's 53. Wilmington's 50 locations included 16 beauty parlors, 14 places to dine, 7 taxi businesses, 3 barbershops, 3 drugstores, among many other businesses. African Americans prospered along with the rest of their neighbors, but not equally. Their frustration helped pave the way for the Civil Rights Movement. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, Wilmington's black citizens were once again enfranchised. However, discrimination and racism persisted. In the early 1970s, racial tensions erupted in the school desegregation riots and the trial of the Wilmington 10, where 10 people were imprisoned on the charge of firebombing a local grocery store known as Mike's. Both the riots and the trial received national coverage from the media. They were pardoned in 2012 by North Carolina Governor Beverly Perdue 50 years after the actual firebombing of Mike's grocery store. These events left an important legacy which Wilmington still endeavors to overcome. Today, Wilmington is experiencing yet another period of economic expansion, and it is clear that African Americans continue to have a crucial role in its development. By exploring their experiences and contributions in the past, it is hoped that you may come to appreciate their significance to the city's present and future.
Ballin' like Houston, ayy, feeling like Whitney. Yeah, I need a bag, bruh. Send it through quickly. I'm making his dog like I'm in the big leagues. Yeah, I told him I'ma hit it out of stands. I deserve another 100 bands. I deserve another 100 fans. Told him this was always in the plans.